Picture it. Everything modern gone by nightfall. No warmth waiting at the turn of a dial, no store to run to, no voice on a screen warning you what's coming. Outside, the snow has buried the roads whole. The rivers have frozen into solid stone, and spring is 120 nights away. How long would you last? A week? 2? Could you even name the day you'd run out of food? For the people of medieval Europe, this was not a game of imagination. This was every winter of their lives. And here's the fact that should send a chill down your spine. They faced colds so violent that one wrong decision could kill a family before the sun rose. Winters that froze wolves out of the forests and up to the edges of the village fences, and yet, generation after generation, most of them survived. Now, most people hear that and assume they know why. They must have been made of harder stuff than we are. They weren't. The average peasant was often hungry, exhausted from labor that never ended, and one bad fever away from the grave. No central heating, no insulated walls, no forecast, no shelf to restock what the cold stole from them. Strip away every comfort we lean on, and they had less than nothing. So how did they walk out the other side of a season built to kill them? Not through strength, not through some lost secret, through preparation so relentless it began while the fields were still green. Because to a medieval villager, winter was never a disaster that struck without warning. It was the reckoning the whole year had been building toward, the silent judge that measured every choice they'd made. Every tree cut in the summer heat, every roof patched before the frost, every last sack of grain sealed away after harvest, each one answered the same brutal question, the one that hung over every household like breath in cold air. Who would still be alive when spring returned? And that is the secret modern life has quietly erased from our memory. The war against winter was never won in the snow. It was won in the sun. So the work began long before the first snowflake, in the warm months when winter felt like someone else's problem. Hay came first. Cut it too early and it lost its strength. Cut it too late and the autumn rains rotted it where it lay. Every stack that dried clean was another animal that would live until spring, and every ox that lived was another field plowed, another family fed the following year. Then came the wood. Across England, France, and the German lands, forests were carefully guarded, and most families could gather fuel only through ancient legal rights called estovers, taking a fixed share and never a branch more. But fresh-cut wood was almost useless. Green logs hissed and smoked and gave back barely any heat, so villagers split their timber, stacked it off the damp ground, and left it to season for months. And if you had walked through such a village in late autumn, you could have read a family's odds of survival in a single glance, just by the size and dryness of their wood pile. That pile was not firewood. It was a measure of who would see April. The same quiet urgency ran through everything. Grain dried and sealed in raised granaries, safe from damp and rats. Turnips and carrots and beets buried in straw-lined pits, a natural cold cellar centuries before refrigeration. Animals they couldn't feed, slaughtered around the feast of St. Martin in November, the meat salted and smoked to last. There's an old proverb that says wood cut in summer warms you twice, once while you swing the axe, and again months later beside the fire. And at the center of every home that fire burned without a modern chimney, the smoke drifting up through the thatch, drying the roof timbers, keeping the meat, holding the room warmer than the killing cold outside. A family that lost its fire could be live coals from a neighbor, and the neighbor gave them, not only out of kindness, but because a freezing household was a danger to the entire village. And yet, even the hottest hearth had a limit. Because the greatest source of heat in a medieval winter was never the fire at all. The greatest source of heat was the human body itself. And medieval people had mastered the art of protecting it centuries before science could explain why it worked. They understood one simple rule: never lose warmth faster than you can make it. So they never trusted a single heavy coat, they trusted layers. A linen shirt against the skin to pull away the sweat that could freeze a man from the inside out. Over it, wool, one of the finest survival materials ever used, trapping tiny pockets of warm air even when it was damp. And over that, a heavy cloak, rubbed with animal fat to shed the rain and melting snow. Feet were packed with dry straw or moss inside leather boots, replaced the moment they grew wet. And the body's furnace needed fuel, so winter meals leaned on rye bread, oats, beans, salted pork, and rich animal fat, food that burned slow and steady through the day. On the coldest nights, whole families pressed into the smallest room around the hearth, parents and children and grandparents together, dogs and livestock adding their own warmth to the dark. It was not crowding by accident. It was survival by design. Every heartbeat another small fire. And yet here is the truth that overturns everything we imagine about a medieval winter. When we picture it, we see snow and frozen rivers and biting wind. But historians have reached a colder conclusion. For most villages, the cold was never the greatest killer. Hunger was. Starvation did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, shrinking each meal, thinning the reserves, until by February, the village reached the season it feared above all others, the hungry gap, when the grain bins ran low and every single meal became a calculation about how many days were left. And hunger took more than the body. It dimmed the mind, clouded judgment, wore down the will, and slowly stripped away the person someone used to be. Which is why, in those last desperate weeks before spring, the thing that decided who lived was not the size of the harvest at all. It was whether a neighbor was still willing to reach out a hand. From the outside, a village in winter looked like a scatter of lonely houses, each one sealed against the cold and fending for itself. But that stillness was an illusion. Beneath the snow ran an invisible network that carried food, labor, information, and sometimes the thin line between life and death. No single household could survive every misfortune alone. A roof might buckle under the weight of snow, an ox might die, a fire might go out, and one disaster on top of another could finish a family. So the village watched itself. The women gathered at the well noticed who had stopped drawing their share. The miller saw whose grain was running thin. The blacksmith knew who could no longer afford to mend a tool. And the parish priest, who stepped inside nearly every home to baptize, to bless, to sit with the dying, knew exactly which household was closest to the edge. Together, without ever naming it, they had built an early warning system. And the church itself became a place that handed out grain and fuel when a family's own supply failed. Even the calendar was a survival schedule in disguise. The Feast of St. Martin marked the slaughter and the last preparations. Advent slowed the fieldwork, but never the labor. Candlemas in February forced every family to ask whether the food would truly last, and Lent, remembered now as a fast, quietly stretched the dwindling stores exactly when they ran lowest. For these people, faith and survival were never separate things. They breathed to the same rhythm. And for centuries this whole system held, until nature changed the rules. Beginning around 1315, relentless rain drowned the fields before the grain could ripen, and the Great Famine swept across Europe, one failed harvest breeding the next. Then, a generation later, the Black Death arrived and took up to half of everyone. The houses still stood, the fields still waited, but the hands that had kept it all alive were gone. And in one small village, that terrible truth was about to change everything. Historians who have studied this world closely, scholars like Zvi Razi, Richard Smith, and Christopher Dyer, working through manor court rolls and parish records from villages such as Hales Owen, keep finding the same quiet pattern. Families rarely collapsed without warning. There were always signs. A household buying less grain than usual, a chimney giving off less smoke than it should, children who stopped appearing at church, a roof left unmended after a heavy snow. To a stranger, these were nothing. To the village, they were alarms. And the winter of 1362 to 1363, when England was still reeling from the plague, shows what happened when no one heard them in time. In Canterbury that year, the cold came early and refused to leave. Among the households was one that had always managed on its own. They never complained, they never asked for charity. From the outside, nothing looked wrong, but inside, the wood had nearly run out, the grain was almost gone, and the parents had begun skipping meals so the children could eat. Then the fire died. Tomorrow, they told themselves, they would ask for help. Tomorrow they would go to the priest. Tomorrow someone would notice. Tomorrow never came. When the priest finally pushed open the door, drawn by the silence and the cold chimney, he found 5 of them gone. Taken not because help did not exist, but because it arrived too late. Historians rightly urge caution with stories like this. The records survive in fragments and the details blur. Yet the pattern beneath them is undeniable. The families who became isolated were the ones who died. Which tells us something the medieval world understood better than we do. Their greatest technology was never the hearth, the granary, or the wool cloak. It was trust. And the hardest part of survival was never the cold. It was finding the courage to admit weakness, to knock on a door and say, "I cannot do this alone." That has never been easy. Not in the 14th century, not today. So let me leave you where we began. If everything modern vanished tonight, and you were dropped into that frozen village, what would save you first? Not your strength, not your knowledge, but whether you could trust the people around you, and let them trust you in return. History suggests that is the answer, and it is not the one most of us expect. So tell me in the comments, which survival strategy surprised you the most? The homes built around a single fire, the food buried in the earth, or the invisible web of neighbors that mattered more than any flame? Share your thoughts below, subscribe if you want more of these forgotten histories, and until next time, stay curious.